There is no such thing as a spiritual war. When you fight a war, the aim of that war is to defeat your enemy. They involve violence, they involve threats, they involve propaganda, and they involve, let's put it like this, shock and awe. And the eating of human flesh was designed to strike fear in the heart of the enemy. Here we are strong, we are tough, and if necessary, we'll eat you up alive. And to a certain extent, that succeeded. I mean, there was a wave of horror and fear. They eat us. And if they're eating us dead tomorrow, they might eat us alive.
To the leaders of the crusade, the barbarity that took place at Murat proved that their troops wouldn't tolerate any more delays. The time had come to fulfill their vows and seize the city that had inspired them to risk everything in the name of God. It made no difference that Jerusalem had recently fallen into the control of a far more conciliatory Muslim power, the Fatimids of Egypt, and that they were calling for peace. In June 1099, 13,000 crusaders, less than a quarter of the number that had originally set out from Europe, arrived at the gates of the city where Jesus Christ had died.
When the Crusaders reached the walls of Jerusalem, they finally arrived at their goal. After 3 years, 3,000 miles marching, the most incredible suffering, terrible, terrible losses, they'd arrived at the holy city. Some were so overwhelmed with emotion they wept, others prostrated themselves on the ground. But now, of course, the hardest task of all faced them. They had to break in.
After 3 years of crusade, the Christian army prepared to attack Jerusalem. The walls were 50 feet high and 10 feet thick. To scale them, they would need ladders and siege towers. But the Muslim defenders had razed the entire surrounding area of trees. The Christians sent out foraging parties to scavenge for wood. Hidden in a hole in the ground, they found 400 pieces of ready-prepared timber. It seemed once again God was giving them a helping hand. It was enough timber to build 2 50-foot siege towers with which to attack the walls of Jerusalem. Everything was in place for the final assault. On the 14th of July, 1099, the Crusaders launched a 2-pronged assault. The 2 siege towers were rolled into place, one to the northwest and the other to the south of the city. Then the Crusaders climbed the towers to try and fight their way onto the battlements, all the while under a merciless barrage.
You can look up at these walls and imagine missiles, stones, arrows raining down upon you. The fighting was barbaric and intense, and at one point the Crusaders gave the phrase live ammunition its literal meaning. They captured a Muslim, strapped him to a catapult and fired him back over the walls.
To the south, the Muslims pelted the first siege tower with pots of oil and flaming bolts, until finally it went up in flames. Now only one siege tower was left, to the northwest of the city under the command of the revered Crusader general, Duke Godfrey.
Godfrey decided upon a change of plan. I've got here an eyewitness account written by a man called Raymond of Aguillet. This is what he said. Godfrey moved to a position between the Church of the Blessed Stephen and the Valley of Josaphat.
Godfrey's plan was inspired. He had found the weak spot in the Muslim fortifications, but it was over a mile round to the northeast of the city. Under the cover of darkness, he had his men wheel the siege tower to the less defended part of the wall in just a few hours.
Here we are, the spot that the Crusaders broke into Jerusalem.
the Muslims mounted one last-ditch attempt to destroy Godfrey's siege tower.
They used grappling irons to try and snare the tower, to use the hooks to catch the wood, and then, remarkably, to pull the thing over. To counter this, the Crusaders had an enormous scythe made that would cut through these ropes. At one moment, there was a brief fire there up on the walls. Godfrey saw this and lowered a makeshift bridge from his tower onto the battlements.
The walls were breached, and the Muslim defenders ran for their lives. The Christians at last could seize the holy city of Jerusalem.
We chased the Saracens, and killing them all the way up to Solomon's temple. Before long, its walls were streaming with blood. We killed both men and women, cutting off their heads with our drawn swords. The surviving Saracens dragged the dead bodies out in front of the city gates and piled them up in mounds as high as houses. No one has ever seen or heard such slaughter of pagans. For they burnt them on pyres as high as pyramids. No one knew how many there were. Except God. Jerusalem is ours.
Almost 3 years after he left his lands in northern France, Duke Godfrey would become the new Christian ruler of Jerusalem. Humbly, he refused to be crowned king in the city where Jesus Christ had worn a crown of thorns. A year later, he died in the holy city. He was succeeded by his younger brother, Baldwin, Count of Edessa. He didn't share his brother's theological qualms, and, at the urging of his advisors, took the title King of Jerusalem. News spread back to Europe of the extraordinary success of the First Crusade. But the inspiration for 60,000 men to travel 3,000 miles, Pope Urban died before learning that Jerusalem was back in Christian hands for the first time in 400 years. The medieval walled city of Jerusalem is only half a mile across. Within this space, the Crusaders had massacred an estimated 30,000 Muslims and Jews. News of the slaughter rocked the Islamic world.
The Crusades had a very deep impact on Arab society. One, they were seen as a barbarian incursion, and stories of those crusades are still told in cafes and in families as if they happened yesterday. This is something quite striking. And so whenever the West has invaded that region again, people say it's another crusade, which is why after the awful events of 9/11, when the American president inadvertently, one assumes, said we now have to wage a crusade to stop this, a shiver went down the collective spine of the Islamic world, because they felt they knew what was coming.
As the Crusaders rejoiced in victory and planned how to consolidate their hold on the Holy Land, the Muslims prepared to strike back. It would not be long before the wrath of Islam was unleashed on the fledgling Christian kingdom of Jerusalem.